Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Chowchak Wing Museum. It's a great privilege of mine to introduce the presenter for our talk this afternoon. My name is Craig Barker. I am the Head of Public Engagement for the museum, so welcome to our space. Firstly, and very, very importantly, I wish to acknowledge the fact that the museum and the University of Sydney more broadly is on the grounds of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and that the Chowchak Wing Museum acknowledges and respects the traditional custodians of the land on which we are meeting today, unceded land. We are incredibly excited on this note, as well as some of you may have seen in recent media. But if you have not had a chance yet, after Connie's fascinating talk this afternoon, I invite you to have a look at the 3 Camoi spears on display just outside of this auditorium space. These spears were confiscated by James Cook and his men in 1770 when the Endeavour was in Botany Bay, and they are now on the property of the collection of the University of Cambridge. They've been back out in Australia since 2020, initially on display at the National Museum of Australia, but this marks the first time that they've been back on country in 252 years. They are a symbol of how far Australia has come in terms of our bettering relationship between our First Nations people and the broader Australian community, but also a symbol of how much further we have to go, and also a symbol of continuity and survival. So we are honoured to have them in our museum and very excited to have them welcome back to country. We had a ceremony yesterday in which La Perouse community members danced them back onto country, which was incredibly moving. The other thing I'd like to mention before introducing Connie is that this talk is presented in conjunction with the Greek Festival of Sydney. We've been working with the Greek Festival of Sydney for more than a decade now, and look forward to many, many, many more years of collaboration. And if you've not had a chance to check out their program, a really, really exciting range of events celebrating Greek culture, both ancient, in our case today, and through to more modern times, and some really interesting films in their film festival as well. The Chowchak Wing Museum is open until 4 o'clock this afternoon, so you're most welcome to stay and view, and our cafe likewise is open for the rest of the afternoon. But now to the main reason we're here, and it's a great privilege to welcome our presenter today. Connie Skibinski is going to be talking to us about heroism in ancient Greek epics. And Connie is currently undertaking her PhD at the University of Newcastle in the subject of classics. She completed a Bachelor of Arts with joint honours in ancient history and in ancient Greek here at the University of Sydney, so one of our proud alumni. And her primary research interest is in Greco-Roman mythology, particularly figures that would be regarded by ancient Greeks and by us in the modern world as heroes and heroines. She is particularly interested in the adaptation of ancient mythology from the medieval period through to the contemporary era, the concept of reception studies in the broader sense of understanding how the classical world can be viewed through a more modern lens. Her doctoral thesis is one of those classical reception studies, quite specifically on Amazonians, who I'm assuming we're going to be seeing today, and in particular the Amazonian queen Her name is one of those I always trip over, so I will apologise in advance, but Connie will pronounce it correctly, unlike me. Penthesilus. See, I've done it. Sorry. Anyway, moving on. In her doctoral thesis, Connie is examining written and visual representations from both antiquity through to the 20th century. So I think what we're getting this afternoon is a bit of a sneak of the final product, and good luck with the rest of the thesis. I can't wait to read the book, which will come eventually. But ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Connie.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that introduction. Just to check, is this volume okay for everyone? Brilliant. Thank you. And yeah, welcome. Thank you so much to everyone who's taken the time to turn up today. It's my absolute honour to be speaking as part of the Greek Festival of Sydney to talk about heroism in the ancient Greek epics. It's a topic I'm really passionate about, and I hope you all enjoy it today. And yeah, so today in this talk, I'm going to focus specifically on two key heroes from the Trojan War myth. I'm going to explain a little bit about what makes them heroic figures according to the ancient Greek understanding of heroism, and why these characters still resonate and are relevant in the world today as well. Okay, there we go. And I want to first begin with a brief overview of the actual Trojan War narrative, so the wider, bigger picture story, before we dive into the specific heroes that we're going to look into. So the Trojan War myth is a story of truly epic proportions. It features heroes, heroines, gods, goddesses, monsters, war, peace, quests. It's a very big story with a lot of interesting things happening in it. And it also takes place over a very extended period of time. So the war itself lasted for 10 years, and there was at least 20 years of an aftermath as well. So altogether, it kind of does span 30 years of narrative space. And the narrative, being so long, is told across several ancient sources. So as we can see depicted on the slide, it's not just the one story by the one author, but they all work together. So and these 8 sources, they are what's called the Trojan epic cycle. They were all written in the 8th century BC, so that's the ancient time period we're looking in. And the very first source in the story, the Kypria, explains the origins of the Trojan War. So it tells us, in summary, Aphrodite, one of the goddesses, goddess of love, promised the Trojan prince that he could marry Helen, who was the most beautiful woman. But she was already married to someone else. So long story short, that conflict was one of the things that prompted this massive water breakout between the Trojans and the Greeks. And yeah, the Kypria, so this first story, it's a lost text. We only have some small fragments of it. The next source in the list is Homer's Iliad, which is probably one of the more better known ones today. And it tells just of the final year of the Trojan War. So the story does skip quite forwards from the beginnings to the last year. And the main thing that we'll see in the Iliad, and that we're going to dig into a little more today, is we see the main Greek hero Achilles leading his army of Greeks against the Trojans. In our next source, which is the Aethiopus, it continues right where the Iliad ends, and it tells of more of the Greeks' victories against the Trojans and their other enemies, but it does end with Achilles, the key hero of the Greeks, dying in battle. Our next source, which is the Little Iliad, describes the events that lead right up to the Greeks' ultimate victory against the Trojans. It ends with Odysseus creating the Trojan horse, which we'll look into a little bit more. But basically, long story short, the Trojan horse was a giant statue, wooden statue, that the Greeks actually hid inside as a way to get through Troy, because the Trojans just thought it was a gift, didn't realize there were Greek soldiers inside. When they let it into the city of Troy, the Greek soldiers burst out and killed people, and that led to the destruction of Troy. And then the destruction of Troy is the main subject of the next story in the list, which is the sack of Troy. And yeah, that's basically the aftermath of the Trojan horse, and it brings an end to the Trojan War proper. And then the next story is the Odyssey by Homer, which is another of those maybe better known ones today. And that's where Odysseus, who was the one who came up with the Trojan horse in the first place, he now goes on a very long 20-year journey to get back home after destroying Troy. And along that long journey, he comes across many monsters and quests and obstacles, many of which we'll be seeing in more detail. In terms of the survivability of these texts, so most of them, except for the Iliad and the Odyssey, we don't actually have surviving copies today. Fortunately, with the Aethiopus, the Little Iliad, and the Sack of Troy, we do have a copy from a few centuries after called the Post-Homerica. So when I do in this presentation read excerpts from the ancient stories, I will be reading from, here we go, the Iliad and the Odyssey and post-Homerica. So just keep those names in mind if you want to, because they will be coming back again later. Okay, so now that we've had an overview of what the Trojan War narrative actually is and how the heroes fit into place within that, we're going to spend the rest of this talk exploring in detail two important heroes of the Trojan War. So on the left, yes, on the left we have Achilles, who is, as I said, the ultimate Greek warrior who fought against the Trojans. And on the right we have Odysseus, who is the cunning hero. He built the Trojan horse. He had many adventures on his journey back home. I picked these two heroes in particular because they provide two very different models of heroic behaviour. Achilles' heroism is tied mostly to warfare and to his heroic feats in battle, so he's a majoritively military type of hero. And his legacy endured through mythology, mostly because of his deeds in the Trojan War, his fighting. And then, by contrast, Odysseus is known not so much for his actual actions during the battle, but more so for his adventures afterwards. So he's known for the perilous journey at sea that he had and the monsters that he encountered. So two quite different types of heroism, one being confined to the battlefield, the other being more about quests and monsters. And on the topic of artefacts, so I've put some artefacts on the slide, but I also want to mention, quite excitingly, there is actually a Trojan War exhibition here at this museum. So it's in the Animal Gods collection. It's on level 2. It's near the cafe right around the corner. So I strongly encourage you to check it out after this talk if you want to. It does have some artefacts that we'll be seeing today and some familiar names and faces as well that we'll be looking at. Great. So first half of this presentation is just going to be looking at Achilles and what makes him heroic. So I've narrowed it down into 4 specific areas that we will be looking into. And technically, these 4 traits are what are called the traits of the Iliadic hero, meaning that all of the major heroes in Homer's Iliad fit within these criteria, but Achilles probably epitomizes them the best. He really does tick all these boxes. So first of all, there we go. First of all, it is typical for a hero to be semi-divine, meaning that they have one mortal parent and one divine parent. This is really crucial to the hero's mode of being because their divine lineage makes them larger-than-life figures who are capable of doing things that exceed everyday regular people. Even their emotions are over the top and larger than life. But at the same time, their semi-divine existence is a source of conflict because at the end of the day, they are ultimately mortal because they have human in their family tree. So that means they're all fated to die. It's a constant dilemma for the hero that despite being godlike in all other ways, they are ultimately mortal and they know that they are going to die one day. A second key trait which characterizes the heroes is their desire for glory. So this particular type of glory in the ancient sources is referred to as kleos. And kleos is a type of glory that warriors can receive as a result for their heroic deeds in battle. This type of glory provides the hero with an enduring legacy that allows their name and reputation to live on long after they die, giving them a symbolic form of immortality. So although they literally die, their name lives on. And yes, since they get this type of glory through their military deeds, it's not surprising that another key heroic trait for them is their military feats. So due to the hero's godlike semi-divine characteristics, they have extraordinary strength and bravery, more so than the average person. And this allows them to essentially go on extreme killing sprees in the battlefield, and they're able to fight at a level that most other people cannot. In the Iliad, major heroes are often compared to wild animals like wolves and lions, which shows that their way of fighting really exceeds the level or the expected abilities of a human. It's inhuman in a way. Transcending the limits of what other people could achieve. And then finally, an Iliadic hero, like Achilles, must have a heroic death. And we're definitely going to see in more detail later what exactly that means when we will look at some artefacts depicting the manner of his death, and when we read through passages about it. But just quickly as an introduction, so a typical heroic death, unsurprisingly given all these other characteristics, it does usually take place on the battlefield. A heroic death is typically signalled by a violent and brutal death in battle, or by the hero's bravery and unflinching defiance right up until the very end. And we will now see in more detail how Achilles satisfies all four of these key traits. Okay. So our first trait, which I will explain through how that's depicted here, but it is Achilles' semidivine heritage. So Achilles' father is the mortal Peleus, king of Phthia, and his mother is the divine Thetis, who is a sea nymph or a nereid. And in this vase painting here, dating to the 6th century BC, we can see a depiction of his father Peleus abducting his mother Thetis to force her into marriage. I want to just note that this story is told in the Kypria, which, if we remember, was the first of those written sources which explains the origins of the Trojan War. And so this male figure here is Peleus, and then the female that he's grabbing onto is Thetis. Okay, so as a nereid, or a sea nymph, one of Thetis' abilities is shape-shifting, and she physically transformed herself into many different forms to try to escape Peleus' grasp. And some of these forms included fire, wind, water, a tree, a bird, a tiger, a lion, and a snake. And if you notice these little animals that we have here, so this small lion, this small snake, they represent, and another snake here, represent some of the forms that she changed into along the way. Peleus was told in advance that she is capable of doing this, and he was told to just continue to wrestle and hold on to her no matter how many forms she takes or what forms they are. So even when she turned into fire and dangerous animals, he just kept holding on. And then eventually she ran out of forms to change into, so she had to revert back into her true woman self, which is the form that we do see depicted here in the main. And once she did so, she sort of had to admit defeat. And then she did have to accept, she was forced to marry Peleus. And from there, when they got married, they then gave birth to Achilles. It's important to keep in mind that Zeus actually deliberately arranged the union between Peleus and Thetis. And the reason why Zeus did this is because there was a prophecy that Thetis would have a son who would overthrow his father. So Zeus feared that if Thetis and a god had a son together, then that son would be even more powerful than his father who is a god. So therefore, Zeus wanted Thetis to give birth with a mortal man, so then at least that son would be more powerful than a mortal, but not more powerful than a god. And so this prophecy ended up being true because Achilles is more powerful than Peleus. As we will soon see, Achilles is like a very, very powerful hero, but he's not more powerful than the gods. He is still immortal. He does still end up dying. Yeah. And then the next trait that we will look at is Achilles' desire for glory or kleos. So throughout the Iliad, Achilles is preoccupied with achieving eternal glory or kleos aphthiton. And this quest for glory is his ultimate driving force, so much so that he's willing to even die to achieve it. In this passage on the screen, taken from Homer's Iliad, Achilles recounts a conversation with his mother Thetis when she told him of the two different fates leading to the final moment of his death. Achilles recalls, "If I stay here and fight at the city of the Trojans, then my homecoming is lost, but I will have eternal glory. But if I return home to my dear fatherland, then my glory is lost, but my long life will endure, and the final moment of my death will not come upon me soon." Yes, so here we can see that Achilles is very much aware of and trying to decide between the two possible options for his fated moment of death. He is very aware that if he stays and fights in the Trojan War, it will result in him dying and dying soon at a young age. But because that will mean being killed in battle, it'll then give him that glory and that sort of symbolic immortality. If he takes the easy path and leaves the battle, he will live long and long, but then his death will not be heroic, so then he will get forgotten in time. Achilles ultimately chooses the first option and decides to stay in Troy and risk his life by fighting alongside the other Greeks. And this exactly matches what we would expect of an Iliadic hero. as it shows just how strong Achilles' desire for glory is. He's willing to die as a young soldier on the Trojan battlefield to give him that heroic glory and renown and allow his name to live on for generations to come. And then our third heroic trait, which we have 2 examples of, is Achilles' extraordinary military feats. So while there are many examples I could have included here, I've narrowed it down to just 2. So on the left, we can see Achilles killing the young Trojan prince Troilus. And then on the right, we can see Achilles killing the Amazon queen Penthesilea. And also this one on the left, this 4th century BC vase, is on display in the Chowchackwing Museum Trojan War exhibition collection, so you can have a look at it after this presentation if you want to. It depicts a scene from the Kypria, and the reason why I chose this one, so 2 reasons. So firstly, it shows a scene that actually does not take place on the battlefield, as we'll see soon. So it shows that Achilles is willing to fight both on and off the battlefield. And also, this scene explains one of the many prophecies that are within the Trojan War narrative. Okay, so yeah, one particular prophecy was that the city of Troy would only fall if the Trojan prince Paris, who's the character there, if he was killed before his 20th birthday. The goddess Athena, who was one of the Greek gods who took the side of the Greeks in the war, knew about this prophecy and advised Achilles to seek out Troilus and kill him no matter the consequences. And this scene shows us just how brutal and violent Achilles is even when he's off the battlefield, because he tracked Troilus down outside the walls of Troy. And in this illustration, we can see that the scene of action is not taking place during battle, but the building that we can see depicted in the middle is actually a temple to Apollo, and Achilles is crouched beside the temple waiting to ambush the young prince Troilus. According to the Kypria and other ancient written sources, Achilles killed Troilus inside the temple, even beheading him on the altar. So the absolute brutality of this action shows that Achilles is willing to kill anyone who might stand in the way of the Greeks' victory. And while this might not seem heroic from a modern perspective, it does fit the ancient model of a warrior hero willing to do whatever it takes to win the war, no matter the consequences. A second example of Achilles' military feats is depicted in this image here on the right, where he fights in one-on-one combat with Penthesilea, one of the queens of the Amazons. For context, the Amazons were a formidable tribe of women warriors descended from the war god Ares. Amazons are trained to use weapons from birth, and their entire society and daily practices revolve around hunting and war training. In the Iliad, Homer refers to the Amazons as equals to men, meaning that they are as skilled in battle as the Greek male warriors. In this 6th century BC visual representation, we can clearly see that Penthesilea is portrayed in the conventional mode of a warrior. So she has a plumed hoplite helmet, which is actually pretty much identical to Achilles, showing that they both have similar warrior status. And she also has full armor and a shield to the side as well. So we can tell immediately this is a scene taking place on the battlefield. This scene takes place from the beginning of the Aethiopus, which, if we remember, is the book that comes just after Homer's Iliad. And in this section of the story, Priam, who was the king of Troy, feared that the Greeks were becoming too successful and fighting against the Trojans with too much success too quickly. So Priam called in the Amazons as an ally to fight against the Greeks, thinking that if anyone can beat the Greeks, it's going to be these warrior women. And the Amazons were extremely successful. They did kill many named and unnamed Greek soldiers, right up until the final showdown between Achilles and Penthesilea. And this is where Achilles actually manages to kill Penthesilea. So if we look closely, we can see that he actually has a really long spear and he's stabbing her just in the chest with it. And this sort of kneeling submission pose that she's doing is kind of one iconographical visual clue to show that she's actually powerless in this moment. And it's often used for dying warriors or warriors that are being, I guess, humiliated on the battlefield. Yep, and then with Penthesilea being dead, the remaining Amazon warriors scatter because they don't really know what to do without their queen in charge. And then, with the Trojan allies being defeated essentially, it kind of brings back the power to the Greeks and it levels out the playing field a little bit more. The fact that Achilles is able to overcome a queen of the Amazons, who are so renowned for their superior military prowess, highlights Achilles' ultimate and unparalleled proficiency in battle. So with these two examples combined, we see that Achilles performed extraordinary military feats against the enemy Trojans, as well as their Amazon allies. Okay. And finally, the fourth heroic trait of Achilles is that he has a heroic death through which he gains everlasting glory. And also this artifact is another one of the ones that is on display here if you wanted to see it afterwards. Okay. At the beginning of the Aethiopus, Achilles is killed when the Trojan prince Paris shoots him with an arrow in the heel. To give Achilles a worthy funeral for a fallen soldier, the Greeks rescue his body and remove him from battle so that they can give him a more proper, decent resting place. In this 6th century BC vase painting, we see that Achilles' comrade Ajax is carrying him away from the Trojan battlefield. And although we can't see Achilles' face, this is his helmet over Ajax's shoulder. And this central figure is Ajax, so the one who is carrying Achilles away. The woman who is standing in front is most likely Achilles' mother Thetis. So one way that we know this is a woman figure is that in these types of vases, the women are depicted with white skin and the men are depicted with black skin. Something important to note is her gesture. So her tearing at her hair is a typical mourning gesture, and it's often depicted for funerals or other kinds of mourning scenes. So in this case, she's mourning his death in battle. This does highlight the very human side of warfare that is at the heart of the Trojan War narrative. So something really interesting about the ancient written sources of the Trojan War is they don't just focus on purely the military aspect, but they do focus on the loss of life and how it affects the men who must stay back and continue fighting, but also how it affects the loved ones back home. So this is actually quite a touching and moving scene being depicted here once we can kind of put ourselves into Thetis' shoes, I think. Achilles' death is narrated in the Aethiopus, but since it is a lost text, the only surviving written description that we do have of Achilles' death comes from the post-Homerica. And I thought I'd just read out a very brief passage describing his death and then go into the significance a little bit. So in the post-Homerica, it states, Achilles fell backwards like a tower struck by the force of a subterranean whirlwind, which agitates the depths of the earth. In such a way, the noble body of Achilles collapsed on the ground. So although that passage is extremely brief, it actually has a lot to go into because it uses some specific literary tropes to portray Achilles' death in a heroic manner. So for one thing, throughout the Iliad, falling similes are commonly used to represent that a death is heroic. So heroes such as Sarpedon, one of the other Iliadic heroes, is compared to a falling tree. And this is quite a common trope because it draws on the idea that both trees and warriors are tall, powerful forces, but that can still be taken down by metal weapons, so an axe or a spear, And another clue that Achilles' death is represented in a heroic way is through the reference to his noble body, which further portrays him heroically, but also presents his death in that sympathetic manner. So just to recap overall, what we have seen with Achilles is that there are 4 key reasons why he is a heroic figure according to the ancient Greek model of the Iliadic hero. And they are his semi-divine lineage as the offspring of the mortal king Peleus and the nymph Thetis, his desire for glory, where he was even willing to die to make his name live on, his military feats such as killing Troilus in an altar and such as killing the queen of the Amazons in battle, and finally his heroic death in battle through which he did get that eternal glory. Okay, and now we have come to the second half of our lecture where we look at our second hero, our Trojan War hero, the cunning Odysseus. Like we did with Achilles, I've narrowed down 4 specific key traits which outline Odysseus's heroic nature. These 4 elements are call to adventure, challenges and obstacles, quests and monsters, and a heroic return come from a wider set of elements known as Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, which is essentially a list of criteria that commonly feature in hero narratives. I want to be really clear that the hero's journey does not apply to ancient stories only, but it actually is a very common narrative pattern for contemporary stories too. For instance, let's use Star Wars as an example to break down these 4 stages. So in Star Wars: A New Hope, the protagonist Luke Skywalker begins in the ordinary world with a normal and humble life as a farm boy before he is called to adventure by Ben Kenobi, who teaches Luke about his Jedi heritage and encourages him to leave his home planet to learn the ways of the Force. As typically happens in a hero narrative, Luke originally refuses the call to adventure. He's hesitant to leave his aunt and uncle behind, but when they get tragically killed, he decides to follow Kenobi on his adventures. On the way, Luke experiences many challenges and obstacles, all of which are necessary for him to overcome in order to harness the Force and leave the Jedi lifestyle behind. These challenges and obstacles require him to leave his ordinary way of life behind and to put all his trust in his mentor, Kenobi. Once he has overcome these challenges, he is ready for his ultimate quest, which is to overthrow the Galactic Empire, which he does in part by destroying the Death Star. The movie then ends with him returning to the Rebel base and receiving a medal for his heroic deeds. Or, as a second example, we can think of the Harry Potter series. For the purposes of time, I'll focus just on the first in the series, Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. So, like in Star Wars 2, the story very much begins in the ordinary world. The young orphan Harry has no idea of his magical powers, and he lives a humble and awful life being mistreated by the Dursleys. The first call to adventure comes in the form of the magical letters delivered from Hogwarts, which invite Harry to attend the School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Interestingly, it actually is not Harry himself who refuses this call to adventure, but the Dursleys refuse it on his behalf because they don't want Harry to know of his own magical strength and abilities. The next call to adventure comes when the giant Hagrid personally comes to escort Harry to Hogwarts, and the Dursleys are so intimidated and frightened that at this stage they allow Harry to go. There are a series of challenges and obstacles that Harry faces as he adjusts to life in Hogwarts, including a brutal Quidditch match and a gruesome troll let loose in the school. These relatively small challenges allow Harry and his companions Ron and Hermione to test their skills, bravery, and spells, but they aren't very deadly. The final major quest that Harry is faced with in the first story is to retrieve the Philosopher's Stone and to avert Voldemort in the process. This involves coming up against the monstrous 3-headed dog Fluffy, as well as other potentially fatal obstacles like the dangerous wizard's chess game, where players can be attacked by the other chess pieces. The story then ends with Harry's heroic return back to the Hogwarts main hall, where he, Ron, and Hermione are each awarded 60 points for their successful quest, making Gryffindor the winners of the House Cup. Okay, so how does this familiar heroic pattern play out with the Trojan War hero Odysseus? Odysseus doesn't quite have the same humble beginnings as Luke Skywalker or Harry Potter, because even before joining the Trojan War, Odysseus was the powerful king of the island Ithaca. However, Odysseus still begins very much in the ordinary world. He is first portrayed in a domestic scene with his wife Penelope and newborn son Telemachus, and he does not want to fight in Troy because he doesn't want to leave his family behind. When the Greeks arrive to summon Odysseus into the Trojan War, he attempts to refuse the call to adventure by pretending to be mad in the hopes that the Greeks will decide that he is not mentally or physically fit to fight. To fake madness, what Odysseus does is he plows salt into his fields, which is obviously a very irrational thing to do because that would completely destroy his crops and risk them not even being able to eat food. But the Greeks are a little bit skeptical and they think maybe he's just putting this on. So they get his infant son and put the son in front of the plow. And then Odysseus quite naturally swerves to avoid killing his son. So then the Greeks say, well, if he's rational enough to know that that's his son, to know that he should swerve away, this whole madness is completely faked. So they don't let him get out of joining the war, so he's unable to properly refuse the call to adventure. Challenges and obstacles. Yes, of course. Throughout his adventures, Odysseus then comes across many challenges and obstacles, and we're going to soon go into two in detail. So these, what I'm calling the challenges and obstacles, they don't directly threaten his life, but they do seriously hinder his journey and affect his ability to return back home to his family by delaying that process by several years. And that's why altogether it does take him 20 years to return home. And the two challenges/obstacles that we will look at shortly are his time on Calypso's island and his run-in with the sorceress Circe. Odysseus also overtook several perilous quests involving monsters. And the two examples that we will look at shortly are his escape from the Cyclops Polyphemus and his near-fatal interaction with the sirens. And then finally, after overcoming all the challenges, obstacles, quests, and monsters thrown his way, Odysseus returns home to his island of Ithaca, where he is treated as a hero, is accepted by his loyal wife Penelope, who refused to remarry in his absence. And just before we move on to dig deeper into Odysseus' heroic portrayal through his challenges and obstacles and his quests and monsters, I just want to be clear that the reason why I did use the contemporary examples of Star Wars and Harry Potter to introduce the heroic journey is so that we can see, in my opinion, Odysseus better suits our contemporary understanding of heroism, more so than Achilles, who is purely just that military type of hero. So with Achilles, his desire for bloodshed and warfare perfectly fits the ancient Iliadic definition of a hero, but perhaps doesn't resonate quite as much in the modern day, whereas Odysseus's journey really does fit modern hero narratives, modern protagonists in contemporary stories. So as I explain now in more detail what does make Odysseus a hero in the ancient stories, I encourage you to think about whether you think that matches with modern ideas of heroic protagonists as well. Okay. So now we are digging, as I said, more deeply into the challenges and obstacles, so the non-fatal things that Achilles went on, but which still really hindered or delayed his ability to return back home. One thing to note that we can immediately see in these vase paintings is that in both instances, the adversary characters are attractive women, and thus they represent temptation in some way. Calypso, who is the one that we can see depicted on the left here, she was especially famed for her beauty. She was one of Atlas's daughters, who were believed to be among the most beautiful of all the nymphs. In the Odyssey, descriptions such as shining Calypso and the nymph with the lovely braids describe her extraordinary beauty. And in this 5th century BC vase painting, we can likewise see that she's portrayed as young and beautiful. It's interesting to note that her name, Calypso, literally translates to she who conceals, and this may be because her beautiful outer experience conceals her extremely problematic nature. Odysseus accidentally ends up on Calypso's island when his ship is destroyed, and he has to create a raft from the fragmented remains of his ship. After drifting at sea for 9 days, Odysseus finally ends up on the island Ogygia, where he meets Calypso. At first, this seems to be a positive development in his story. Calypso rescues him, he's a shipwrecked hero, she offers him a safe place in her home, and as part of her hospitality, she nursed him back to health, and she played enchanting music for him, and that's actually what we see depicted here. So she's playing music for him, he seems very sort of comfortable and laid back, and he's recovering and he's healing, and it's all looking good so far. But then everything takes a turn for the worst when Calypso falls in love with Odysseus and plans to make him immortal so that he can stay on her island forever. But Odysseus protests to this because he has a wife back home that he wishes to return to. But Calypso completely ignores his protests and actually keeps him trapped on the island against his will, and she even forces him to be physically intimate with her. Odysseus remained trapped on Calypso's island for 7 years before finally Zeus intervened by sending the messenger god Hermes to rescue Odysseus. When Hermes explains the situation to Calypso, she is really reluctant to let Odysseus leave. She protests and exclaims, "You unrivaled lords of jealousy, scandalized when goddesses sleep with mortals." So there she's commenting on a perceived double standard, that the male gods typically abducted women and people would not turn a blind eye, but then they punish her for doing the same with the genders being reversed. Despite her unwillingness to free Odysseus, she ultimately has no choice because she's not able to overpower Hermes because Hermes is a god. So Calypso provides Odysseus with a new boat and food provisions to aid him in his travels back to his wife Penelope in his faraway homeland Ithaca. So overall, Calypso represents a massive obstacle for Odysseus, as she prevented his homecoming by a further 7 years, on top of his already long journey back home after the war, but she never directly threatened his life, as the monsters that we'll see later did. And let's now take a look at Odysseus' interactions with Circe, so the story that we see depicted on the right here. As we can see, Circe is another beautiful and powerful woman who served as a challenge or obstacle that Odysseus had to overcome in order to return home. Circe is a sorceress or a witch, capable of using herbs to perform magic. Her magical powers are far-reaching, and they include transmutation, which is turning something from one form to another, illusion, which is creating tricks or hallucinations, necromancy, which is communicating with the dead. And this passage is told in Homer's Odyssey, where we learn that Odysseus and his men land on Circe's island, and they're actually immediately drawn there by their magical powers. They just don't know that that's how they got there. When they land on her island, they figure out the best way to safely get off, because again, the whole time they are trying very slowly to get back home again. And they split off into two groups, one team led by Odysseus and another team led by Eurylochus. So the group that's led by Eurylochus, as they're walking around the island, they stumble across Circe's palace. And they find her, they're immediately enchanted by her seductive qualities. She offers them hospitality and they agree, so they enter her palace. She makes them a really extravagant meal of cheese, barley meal, honey, and wine. But all of this food that she gave them was laced with a drug that made them confused and disorientated. In their drugged out state, she then strikes them with a magic wand, which actually turns Odysseus' men into pigs. And you'll notice in this illustration here, we have this weird creature who, on the top, like that's the head of a pig, but then the body of a man. So this artist here is illustrating that process of magical transformation of one of the men being turned into a pig. Eurylochus, while this was all happening, Eurylochus, the leader of this group, hung back to watch because he was a little skeptical and thought maybe we shouldn't just eat food given by a woman we don't know. And as you watch this happen, he then runs off and tells Odysseus, like, hey, come and rescue your men, they've been turned into pigs. Odysseus knows, though, that he can't just run straight into this because he has no way to protect himself from Circe's magic. But fortunately, Hermes, the messenger god who has intervened in this story a few times earlier, he goes to Odysseus and gives him a magic herb that can protect him from Circe's powers. So now Odysseus is immune to Circe's magic, so he can enter her palace and he threatens her at sword point. We can see here that he is holding a sword to threaten her. And he basically just, threatens her to turn his men back into men. And she does so. She doesn't hesitate at all. And then Odysseus and his men happily stay on Circe's island for a full year afterwards, enjoying her hospitality. This time she doesn't drug them or try to turn them into animals. But then after a year of them just having a nice time and hanging out, his men remember that they do need to return back home to their wives, to their sons. So, yeah. And all in all, this story represents not only the dangers of sexual temptation represented by Circe, but also the dangers of comfort and pleasure, because Odysseus and his men, they almost lose sight of the motivation to return home because they are just so comfortable lying around and eating. So to recap these two stories together, Odysseus' forced entrapment on Calypso's island for 7 years, and then his voluntary stay on Circe's island for 1 year, do provide obstacles to his primary quest to go back to his homeland after fighting in the Trojan War. And although these challenges delayed his journey by 8 long years, they didn't pose an immediate threat to his life, unlike the monster stories which we will now see. Okay, so while there are several deadly monsters that Odysseus came up against during his travels, we will be focusing on just 2. So the Cyclops Polyphemus depicted on the left, and the sirens as shown on the right. One thing that we can immediately note is that these creatures are not beautiful women like Circe and Calypso. So the Cyclops Polyphemus is... just pretend I'm pointing at him. That'll come back soon. So yes, the Cyclops Polyphemus on the left is a giant figure. And the way that we can tell that is if you just compare the scale of Odysseus, where we see his entire body, to Polyphemus, where we only see kind of from the waist up. Another way that Polyphemus's abnormal physical appearance is different, which we can't actually tell just from this vase illustration, but he actually only has one eye, and it is centered around the middle of his head. So I know in this picture, because we've got a sort of weird side view happening, it kind of looks like both Odysseus and Polyphemus only have one eye. But keep in mind that Cyclops have just the one big eye in the center of their forehead. And as an interesting and relevant side tangent, it is believed that the mythic tales of the Cyclopes actually originated from the ancient Greeks coming across elephant skulls, because with an elephant skull, where the tusk would be stays a hole, which kind of looks like a giant eye socket. And in the Trojan War exhibition at this museum, there is an elephant skull, so you can have a look at it and see for yourself. And if you didn't know it was an elephant, you might be tempted to think it's a giant one-eyed monster. And as well as having a monstrous appearance, the Cyclopes are also monstrous in their actions. So in the Odyssey, they are described as lawless and inhuman because they don't farm their food, they don't assemble in groups, they have no laws, they have no community bonds, and they live alone in caves on the tops of high mountains. When Odysseus and his men arrive on the Cyclops' island in Book 9 of the Odyssey, Odysseus is determined to find out for himself if the Cyclopses truly are the uncivilized savages that he's heard about. So he brings a gift of gold, silver, and wine to Polyphemus' cave just to see if maybe he's not quite as bad as they feared. But when Polyphemus does see Odysseus' men, he immediately grabs two of them, eats them, and then falls asleep. So yes, he is very monstrous. And now we have an extra layer to Polyphemus' monstrosity, which is that he is a man-eating monster, so he's now posing an immediate threat to Odysseus' life. Odysseus therefore has to devise a clever plan to rescue himself and his remaining men. They can't simply leave the cave while Polyphemus sleeps, because there is a giant boulder rolled across the entrance of the cave that these human men are not strong enough to move. You have to be as strong and as tall as a Cyclops to be able to move that massive boulder. So they have to keep Polyphemus alive so that he can let them out. Odysseus notices a gigantic club in the corner of the cave. We're not exactly sure what it's for, but perhaps Polyphemus used it like as a stick to shepherd his sheep. So what Odysseus does while Polyphemus is asleep is he sharpens the edge of the club to make it a giant stick, which is actually, there we go, what we see depicted here. And then what Odysseus does next is he gives Polyphemus the wine that he brought as a gift, and he gives Polyphemus so much wine to make Polyphemus extremely drunk, and it works. So then what he does, and this is what we can see depicted here, and it's quite brutal, but Odysseus actually stabs Polyphemus in his one eye using this club, and Polyphemus at this stage is already drunk. He's now in pain, he's now blinded, so he's stumbling around, and Odysseus basically thinks, okay, this is their chance to leave, but he can't just straight away leave because Polyphemus is still near the entrance of the cave, and he can still feel things. If he feels humans, kind of waist height running past them, he's going to probably grab them and eat them. So what Odysseus does, which is very clever, is he sees Polyphemus' sheep who are inside the cave at this stage because it's nighttime. And Polyphemus, takes his sheep out during the day but brings them back into the cave at night. So Odysseus and his men actually kind of jump underneath and cling onto the underside of the sheep. So then as the sheep run past, Polyphemus just thinks they're sheep. He has no idea there's people hiding under them because he's blind at this stage. He can't see that there are men just hanging off the bottom of his sheep. So Polyphemus rolls back the boulder to let his sheep out, not realizing that he's actually let out Odysseus and his men. Okay, so that's that story on the left. And now let's look at this story here, which is Odysseus's narrow escape from the Sirens. Again, we can see that the Sirens have an abnormal or inhuman physical appearance, and this is very characteristic for monstrous figures in Greek mythology. So in this 4th century BC vase painting, we can see that the sirens are physically hybrid beings with the head of a woman and then the body of a bird. So they have the wings, the tail, and the talons of a bird, but then they have a beautiful woman's head. So as hybrid creatures, they straddle the boundary between human and animal, but also between civilized and uncivilized. So it clearly portrays them as threatening, monstrous figures. And like we saw with the Polyphemus story, Odysseus has to use his wits and his cunning in order to survive the sirens. He can't just use his strength, he can't just use weapons. So this scene that we see depicted here comes from Book 12 of the Odyssey, where Odysseus and his men sail past the island of the sirens. Just like we saw with Polyphemus, the sirens are monstrous in both appearance and actions. They have an irresistibly beautiful song, which they use to lure sailors to their death. It's also believed that the myths of the sirens capture or represent ancient Greek fears about the sea and the risk of shipwrecks, because these sirens, they live right on the edge of the ocean, they lure sailors to their death at sea, so possibly that's the kind of real-world explanation for this mythological stories that the Greeks then created to fear others of not going too far out at sea. Odysseus' interaction with the sirens actually overlaps a little bit with the Circe story that we heard earlier. So when Odysseus left Circe's island, she warned him of the many dangers that could await him, and she said that since no sailor on earth can survive hearing the siren's song, that Odysseus' men should put beeswax in their ear to drown out the sound of the deadly song. Odysseus does so for his men, but he decides that he wants to hear the siren song for himself so that he can be the only person on earth who can hear the sirens and get away with it. So he gets his men to tie him up to the mast of the ship. So then that way he can hear them, but he can't move. And if they try to lure him to follow them, he's physically stuck, so he has no way to get away. But his men here, we can't see it in the illustration, but they all have the wax in their ears. So they're actually totally immune to the siren's deadly song. And then, yes, the sirens sing to Odysseus, and they do attempt to lure him to his death. So I'm not going to attempt to sing, but the words that they do sing are, "Come here, renowned Odysseus, great glory of the Greeks. Leave your ship that ye may listen to the voice of us two. For never yet has any man rowed past this isle in his black ship until he has heard the sweet voice from our lips. Nay, he has joy of it, and goes his way a wiser man." So the siren's song very much represents temptation. But because the men in charge of driving the ship can't hear it, and because Odysseus is tied to the mast of the ship and has no way to follow them, they are all able to pass by the island unharmed. They don't end up following the sirens and falling to their death. So once again, we can see that Odysseus is an extremely cunning and wise hero who uses logic rather than sheer force to get himself and his men out of deadly situations. And just to recap our section on Odysseus, which is now drawing to a close. So he is a heroic figure as a result of his ability to overcome a series of obstacles and challenges like the powerful women Calypso and Circe, and his adeptness in escaping monsters, such as the Cyclops Polyphemus and the sirens. And finally, after overcoming these quests and many more, Odysseus finally, after 20 years, returns home to his wife and kids, where he is welcomed and treated like a hero and reunited back into his family. So to conclude now, I wanted to take us back to this earlier slide from when I first introduced you to the two Trojan War heroes, Achilles and Odysseus. And let's come back to the driving question of this presentation. What does it take to be a hero in the ancient Greek epics? What I hope to have shown in this presentation is that there is not just one answer to this question, because even just in the Trojan War narrative and just in Achilles and Odysseus, there is a diversity in hero types, from the military-centric hero Achilles to the cunning, adventurous hero Odysseus. We identified 4 elements which make Achilles heroic: his semi-divine origins, his desire for eternal glory, his military prowess, and his heroic death in battle. We then identified 4 elements which make Odysseus heroic: his call to adventure, his series of non-deadly challenges and obstacles, his fantastical quests and near misses with monsters, and his heroic turn home at the end of the story. But what do these 2 heroes have in common? A crucial similarity is that both Achilles and Odysseus are capable of performing incredible feats that no ordinary mortal can achieve. And this is the crux of the epic hero. They have almost godlike abilities, but they are still human and they can still die. So essentially they occupy a middle ground between regular humans who are mortal and have no special powers, and the gods who are immortal and have special powers. A second similarity between Achilles and Odysseus is that they both have an enduring legacy or everlasting glory as a result of their heroic deeds. Throughout antiquity, stories of these heroes were passed down from generation to generation, and even now in the modern day, many of us recognize the names Achilles and Odysseus. And just before I finish up, I'd like to remind you all of the Animal Gods exhibition located here, right near the Chow Chak Wing Museum Cafe, which contains several artefacts related to the Trojan War myth, some of which we learned about today. And I'd like to thank you all very much for coming today and listening to my talk. Thank you. Thank you. And